Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 3. So, first, I wanted to say I hope that you are enjoying the class so far. And if you have any questions on the material that we have covered so far up to this point, uh, and of course, if you have any questions during week 3, please don't hesitate to send me a line, drop me an email, and I'd be more than happy to discuss or address any of your questions or concerns and clarify any doubts that you might have on the previous material as well as the material for this class, for this lecture. So we are talking about welfare this week, the externalities, the environment, the allocation of goods, and how governments treat that and manage that. Okay, so we are discussing chapter 6, 7, and 8 for this topic. So let's get started. Our first question is, first of all, what are externalities? Okay, and you might have heard perhaps in principles of economics course that you might have taken, or somewhere you might have heard the term being thrown around, externalities. Okay, so it's a very important term in economics, especially in public sector economics. And so what are externalities? Well, externalities are all around us. Okay, there are positive externalities and there are negative externalities. And for the most part, because of the way that government works and the way that society works, we tend to focus more on the negative impacts, the negative externalities, than we do the positive ones. Unfortunately, right? We don't think about some of the positive externalities that are produced, say, for example, from a garden, from a beautiful garden in a neighborhood, or a vaccine, right? We often only think about the negative externalities. And for example, pollution, congestion, traffic congestion, the use of cell phones produces negative externalities. So what are these? Well, say, for example, production, right? A power plant. Yes, a power plant will produce power for a city, for example, and that's good, but it also produces pollution. It pollutes the air. It generates, it can create health problems. These are the negative externalities that are produced from this power plant. On the other hand, you have something like cars, right, which are great, right? They get us from place to place, and we all like our cars, but at the same time, they also produce these negative externalities: congestion, noise, pollution, right? Of course, having cars also means that we are also the risk of having accidents. So the externalities of having an automobile and driving it also produces these other externalities from perhaps the costs associated with traffic accidents, right? And then if you look at something like cell phones, right? The use of the cell phones are great. They allow us to communicate, and they allow us to keep track of things, etc. But they also produce negative externalities, like, for example, less time with our families, less time with our children, less time praying, right? There's a lot of these negative externalities that are produced because we're stuck to our cell phones, right? And so, in fact, there's even I just thought about one here with traffic, right? If a lot of people, unfortunately, text and drive, and this is a negative externality that has been produced because of this cell phone and because of what people have done, and it was unintended, but nevertheless, it's real. And so that is a negative externalities as far as the risk, the dangers that creates, and of course the accidents and unfortunately the deaths that can happen from texting and driving. So that's what externalities are. They are secondary effects. They are the effects of transaction in the market, whether it's a purchase, whether it's a production, whether it's a decision, whether it's an allocation. These are the secondary impacts that transaction produces in society. So let's go to question number 6.2. Okay, how do private markets respond to externalities? All right. What are the limitations of these private remedies? So how do markets respond to them? What can they do to what we call internalize the externality? And there are private solutions that the market can provide to internalize the externality. By the way, when we say internalizing the externality, we mean precisely to getting rid of it or to reducing it to a level that is manageable or desirable for society. Okay? One way that society and the market can internalize an externality is by assigning property rights. If you recall from our previous lectures, we talked about property rights and what happens when they are not clearly established or well defined. And so you need to have clearly established property rights. You need to have contracts. Okay? If you don't have them, you cannot demand anything as far as a property. For example, if everybody owns something, then nobody owns it, right? If you don't have a contract that says, I am the legal owner of this house or this land or this inheritance, then how can you possibly be able to use it, be able to claim ownership of it, and to keep others from taking it and doing what they want with it, right? Ronald Coase, in his famous Coase theorem, talked about that, and he said that if you'd had clearly established property rights, you would be able to arrive at Pareto efficient outcomes. The problem is that you don't always have clearly established property rights. And then another solution that sometimes the private sector uses is they seek the remedy from the legal system. That's why it's so important to have a legal system in place, right? And many countries around the world don't have a legitimate, independent legal system. Their judicial system is filled with corruption and political partisan manipulation, etc. And so when you have that, you don't have the ability to enforce property rights correctly and enforce people's rights, right, in general. So the use of the legal system is an important remedy that the private sector has, but it only works when you have independent and well-working, good-working, sound-working legal systems. Okay, these remedies have limitations, right? These remedies have limitations, and you know the reason it's so difficult to arrive at a Pareto efficient allocation, right? At an allocation that gives us a sound and desirable outcome is because we have these forces in the economy that keep us from arriving at that. For example, asymmetric information, right? And here I have the little lemon with wheels, which is, if you might recall, you might have read it maybe somewhere, that the market for lemons was an article that came out in reference to the market for used cars, right? And if you've heard the expression, you bought a lemon, that's what they're talking about, right? You bought a lemon, meaning that you bought a car that was not what you thought you bought, but because of the asymmetry of information between buyer and seller, you had no idea that you were buying a lemon. And so this asymmetry creates these distortions where it's impossible to determine which are the good cars, which are the lemons, right? And whether you're paying too much or paying or paying correctly, right? And it creates tremendous losses of society and market welfare. You also have the free rider problem, right? The free rider problem makes it also very difficult to arrive at private remedies, because people are always going to find ways to free ride, right? And so how do you charge everybody, right, for their use of something? The market is used to you can discriminate in the private market if you have a store and say for example you sell chocolate, and people come in and they buy the chocolate, they take their chocolate home, and everybody's happy. But in a public provision of a public good, for example, how do you force everybody to pay their equal share or their share that they are using? It becomes a problem because of the free rider problem. And then the third limitation has to do with transactions costs, that nothing in the world happens for free because there's always a transactions cost, right? I am recording this presentation, and there is a transactions cost in the sense that this didn't happen by magic. It required time and effort, and in fact, some even it might require a movement, right? If you have to go somewhere, if you have to go to the store to buy milk, well, now of course we have all these different delivery systems, but if you have to go somewhere to buy a product or to pick up a product, there is a transactions cost attached to it, and nothing happens instantly without a cost. And even for example, these delivery companies that deliver our groceries to our doorstep, they charge a transactions cost, right? They don't do it for free. They are in business because they are able to charge that transactions cost. So the higher the transactions cost, the greater the challenges to providing a Pareto efficient allocation. So going back to Ronald Coase, what Coase said was that if we assume zero transactions cost and perfect information, we can arrive at efficient allocations of resources in society. But as we just said, and as we know, it doesn't exist, right? Information is never symmetrical, it's never perfect, and transactions costs are never zero, because even the simplest transaction requires time. Okay, focus question 6.3. What are the principal ways by which the public sector attempts to deal with externalities? So how does the public sector manage these? What are the advantages and disadvantages of these alternative approaches? So let's look at some of these. Well, some of this public sector solutions to externalities, some are market-based and some are public sector solutions. And we already kind of started talking about some of these, right, when we were discussing the Coase theorem and transactions cost and the free rider, etc. But there are ways, right? You can impose a tax on the production. For example, a CO2 tax, as you see here in the picture, right? You can impose a tax. You can impose regulations, right? Regulations, for example, non-smoking areas. This is a regulation, usually enforced by law, right? We can't smoke on airplanes anymore. We can't smoke on airports except for that one designated room, right, that these airports usually have. You can also find ways to mitigate or internalize the externalities through innovation, perhaps by investing in research and development to try and find better and cleaner or alternative ways to produce, right? Alternative ways to perhaps alternative ways that you can filter some of these harmful chemicals that are spilling over the air, right? There's also disclosure, and this is where the government, the public sector, provides some solutions as far as disclosing information. I remember going back to the asymmetry problem. Back in the day, right, in the 50s and 60s, if you've ever seen one of in YouTube, in fact, you can go and check out some of these old videos of game shows or talk shows, especially talk shows in from the 50s and 60s, or even movies from the 60s and 70s, and you see people smoking in the talk show. You see people smoking in the office, right? It was normal to have people smoke in public places, in offices, in government office buildings and such. Not to mention in talk shows, right? And so back then, you didn't have that full disclosure of information about the harmful effects and impacts of cigarettes, right? So now the Surgeon General has that warning on cigarette labels, and that warning has gotten much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Stricter, or perhaps more belligerent, as far as trying to tell the smoker that you are consuming something that is potentially lethal, right? Banning, for example, the ads close to churches, close to schools, right? Or banning them in places like stadiums, right? I remember in the 90s, I used to go to Fenway Park in Boston when my brother was going to school there, and we used to go to Fenway, and there was this gigantic Marlboro sign that you could see from the stands. Well, that sign was taken down because you no longer allow that. So these are some of the regulations that the government can take, some of the steps that the public sector can take to try and mitigate or internalize the externalities. And then, of course, last but not least, you have compensation and distribution, right? You can try and compensate people for being exposed to the harm, or distribute the harm to the point where it doesn't cause a problem, or it doesn't cause too much of a problem in one specific area. These are not great solutions, but at least they offer some kind of relief. And there's pros and cons, right? There's pros and cons to these solutions, for example, right? You have pros and cons from performance-based versus input-based, right? Regulation versus fines. Okay, which one's better? Should we regulate through legislation, or should we fine people, right? Fining doesn't get rid of it. It just fines you, right? It just fines the polluter or the user, okay? Should we create markets for pollution, for externalities, things that produce externalities? Should we create that? Like, for example, provide marketable permits and sell them to the highest bidder, right? Should we do that? Should we subsidize for pollution reductions versus fines for pollution, right? Should we pay the polluter to find cleaner ways to produce, right? Should we subsidize the research and development, or the production of cleaner technologies, right? These are all the ways that we can, as society and the public sector, ways that we can internalize the externalities. The problem is you have pros and cons for every one of these, right? They're not perfect, and they all themselves, by the way, produce externalities. Focus question 6.4. And I see that these focus questions are actually very long and several questions within one question. But this one says, what currently are the major environmental public policy issues? What policies regarding these issues have succeeded, and what policies have failed? What are some of the current controversies in environmental public policy, and what insights does economic analysis provide into these controversies? Well, beginning with the role of government, okay? The role of government in protecting the environment is about that. It's to protect the environment from damage, right? And going back to the issue of public goods, right? And who owns the air? who who owns the water, right? And nobody owns it, but we all own it, right? We all own the atmosphere, and yet nobody owns it. And so it becomes a real challenge to be able to protect these goods, if you will, right? Because it not only do we not have clearly established property rights, but not every country desires to protect them in the same way. And by the desire, I mean not every country is willing or able to pay for the protections of some of these harmful some of these harms to the environment. Like, for example, acid rain. Who is causing acid rain in the environment? Is it the U.S.? Is it China? Is it other industrial countries? Right? I mean, you have to see who are the ones that are the sources of this. The same thing with water pollution. And by the way, with water pollution, it's not always, we think about water pollution and we think that it's people, that it's firms, right? But it's not always firms. You have a lot of the pollution that comes from water pollution comes from individuals who simply are either don't have the necessary tools, or even the knowledge to discern what they should do with water waste, right? Simply throw stuff in the water. They pollute the watershed. Farms produce a lot of pollution in the watershed, and it flows downstream, right? So who's guilty, right? And so a lot of the water pollution comes from individuals, not necessarily large firms. Something like endangered species, right? Not all the countries are equally being affected by endangered species, as far as the in terms of monetary. If you wanted to place a monetary value on them, but the fact is, there is no way. You shouldn't place a monetary value, because endangered species are, in fact, once they're gone for everybody. And so we should think about them as a good that we all should cherish. The problem is that not all the countries share them in the same way, right? And make the efforts to protect them in the same way. Okay, so that's chapter 6. Now we go on to chapter 7, which talks about efficiency and equity. And here we get into a little bit more complicated discussion about what government can do, should do, to try and find the most equitable allocation, but also efficient. So here's question 7.1. How do economists think systematically about how to make social choices, right, when there are trade-offs? What that is, when, after finding all possible Pareto improvements, gains to the welfare of one individual must come at the expense of the welfare of others. What is the social welfare function, and why do economists find this concept useful? All right, lots in here, lots of perhaps complicated stuff. But see if we can make this simpler than this book is making it. Let's think about going back to our picture of that we shared in our previous lecture on equality versus equity. So this is the picture, right? The famous picture of the three little boys trying to watch the game. And if you think about efficiency versus equity, think about the left picture. Is that efficient? Does that look efficient to you? Well, if you think about efficiency in terms of productive efficiency, it's efficient. I mean, you have 3 citizens in this economy, and so you produce 3 crates. So there's efficiency. You didn't produce 2 or 4. You produced 3. So it is efficient. If you think about, or if you assume that these 3 individuals paid for their crate, then it's also efficient. The market provided 3 crates for as far as supply, and 3 crates were demanded, and so the market cleared. So it is efficient. But the problem is, it's not equitable. obviously, right? It's not equitable. It might be equal access, but it's certainly not equitable in terms of the final outcome. And that's why this becomes so difficult, right? Because now we're talking about equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. It comes down to trade-offs, to evaluating trade-offs, right? And that's really where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Okay, it comes down to evaluating trade-offs. Who decides, right? What's best for society? What's best for society? We all want everyone to be able to watch the ball game, like in the figure below, in the figure before this, right? We want everybody to have a seat at the table. We want everybody to have good education and to be living in a decent home and have the time for their families and to spend and to travel, right? We all want that. Who would not want that for everyone? The problem is who gets to decide, right? And because it's such a difficult question, because who gets to decide, and then in that question, is it fair? Okay, what is it? Is it a fair distribution? And what do you mean by fair? And fair according to whom? Right? If you see freedom, for example, in this cartoon, right? I like this little cartoon. It says freedom isn't as important as fairness. All right. So not freedom doesn't matter. Fairness is what matters. But then the little guy says, who decides what's fair? And the cartoon says, me. So, depending on who decides what's fair will determine fairness. And you think about that, and it has an insightful and intuitive meaning to when we think about what's happening in our country and in the world as far as things, right? And it also has to do with the original position, right? The original position. If you look at the fish here, and you see that the little guy, the little fish, says there is no justice in the world. The bigger guy says there is some justice in the world, right? The bigger fish. And then the biggest of them all says the world is just. And so it depends on where you're looking from, right? The perspective, the lens through which you are looking at the world, right? Those who have all the access and all the resources, they believe the world is just. They see it as just. And those that have some of the access and some of the resources believe that the world is somewhat just. But those that don't have those resources or that access believe the world is unjust. But if you think about in terms of efficiency, these cartoons, especially the fish, it is efficient. I mean, there is no inefficiency to this. This is the big fish eating a smaller fish, and that smaller fish eating the smaller fish. Okay, and it's efficient. Is it fair? That's the big question, right? And it all comes down to evaluating the trade-offs between efficiency and inequality. Okay. So how do economists think systematically about the trade-offs between efficiency and inequality? How do they measure poverty or inequality, for example? How do they measure efficiency? Well, one way economists do this is by looking at a concept in economics called indifference curves. Okay? Now, indifference curves are those curves that show where an individual in an economy would be indifferent between any allocation of goods in an economy, right? And so I might be indifferent between spending $50 in movies to watch the movies and spending $50 to donate to charity, okay? Or indifferent between $75 for charity and $25 to the movies, okay? I'm indifferent. There's an indifference between how I decide on the allocation of my resources and my utility, right? My utility doesn't change. I am indifferent between a different set of allocations. But the problem is that my utility function, my indifference curve may not necessarily coincide with another's indifference curve. Okay? And if you multiply that times 320 million in America, right, in the United States, and if you multiply that times 7 billion in the world, well, you begin to see how it becomes a problem, right? The social indifference curve becomes blurred. It's difficult to figure out what the social indifference curve is, and more difficult even, how to manage it, what to do about it as a public sector economist. And so, for example, if you think about utilitarianism, which says that the more that I have of something, the better the better off I am, or that equality is achieved when we maximize our utility, right? When we maximize the utility of society. But maximizing the utility of society doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to end up with an equal allocation of goods, right? Or a desirable allocation of goods, right? Utilitarianism just means that we are maximizing individuals' utility or happiness, right? Utility is synonymous to happiness in economics. But what does this mean? Well, it can mean that if we have a society of 10 people and 7 of them seek to have all the money spent on football and car racing, right? And they get utility from those 2 allocations, then and then the other 3 don't get any utility from that, you're still maximizing the utility of society, because the utility of 7 that really want that is greater than the disutility of the 3 that don't want that. You're maximizing utility, but it doesn't mean that that's what you want as a society. And so that's utilitarianism, by the way. Jeremy Bentham, the great philosopher and economist Jeremy Bentham, is the one that we credit with utilitarianism, the greater good for the greater number type of thing, maximizing welfare is based on utility. On the other hand, conversely, John Rawls and the concept of Rawlsianism says that we cannot find we cannot have a social maximization of utility if we do not increase the utility of the worst off person, I should say, in the economy. So it doesn't matter, according to Rawls, if we make the better off person better off. That doesn't add utility to society. It only matters when we improve the utility of the worst off person. And of course, you begin to see how this might have some implications and applications of in our society today, right? According to Rawls, then, society should only be concerned about the utility of those at the bottom and not those at the middle or the top. And so you can see how you can very quickly begin to have conflicting views about the world and what government ought to do, right? And whether something is fair or not. Okay? As a practical matter, how do governments translate these general principles into a form that can actually be used in decision making? This is focus question 7.3. So, one way that governments can do this is using or implementing social choice. Okay, the theory of social choice. Here it says social choice in theory. Okay, but there is actually a theory of social choice. fact, you might want to read the works of James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock. Okay, they won the Nobel Peace Prize, by the way, when they were talking with their research in theories of social choice and public choice. Okay, but this is how do governments do it, or how do economists do it? Well, we first construct the opportunity set. Okay, what do we want as a society? What's important to us? What do we need to provide from government? Right. So here we have, for example, temporary assistance for those in need, like TANF programs, right? Supplemental nutrition assistance programs, SNAP, right? The SNAP programs. These are welfare programs, by the way, right? We have Medicaid. So Medicaid is health for individuals with low income. Supplemental security income, the SSI, for retirees that fall within that. Things like fiscal remedies, like the earned income tax credit, and then housing vouchers or housing assistance, like Section 8 housing, for example. So these are different things that we would like society to have and government to provide. All right, so we construct the opportunity set, then we define preferences, and then we adopt the programs that increase social welfare. Right. The problem here is that it might seem easy to define preferences and then adopt those programs that increase social welfare. But the problem here is that there's two problems. First, we don't know what everybody's preferences are in the economy. That's the first problem. And then the second problem is that even if we knew that, these decisions are likely to produce externalities and unintended negative consequences from their application. An example of this happens, for example, in the market for rent controls or rent-controlled apartments, right? You know, if you've ever lived in a rent-controlled apartment, or if you've ever been associated with one, or at least know of how it works, you have the market for apartments in, let's say, Boston, Massachusetts, for example, because my brother lived in a rent-controlled apartment at one point. And what you end up having is you end up with, well, first of all, the market is you have a certain amount of people demanding apartments, and you have a certain amount of the apartments to be provided. But when you have, and if you without a rent control, you have the supply and the demand, right, intersecting in the perfect equilibrium based on what people are willing to pay for apartments, and based on the quantity of apartments available. So if there's over demand for apartments, you're likely to see prices go up. If there is an oversupply, you're likely to see prices be diminished. These are your normal market forces. But what happens with rent control is that the government will impose a ceiling on the price that landlords can charge on rents. And because that ceiling is imposed, what you end up with is a dead weight loss, because the buyer is better off, quote unquote, right? Better off because he or she is paying less than what he would have been willing to pay. So there is a buyer surplus, but the seller surplus is diminished considerably. And that debt weight loss is that debt weight loss to society. Not to mention that the quality of these apartments will also diminish. And so what you're getting is you are getting also a reduction in terms of the product itself, right? Because if you are a rent-controlled landlord, what incentive do you have to keep your apartment nice and neat and well kept and managed? You have very little incentive, because no matter what you do, you cannot charge that tenant any more than what the county or the government, right, the city or whatever, allows you to. And so you end up with two things. You end up with less apartments actually to go around, because the individuals will simply move out of the apartment business and they'll go do something else, or sell their units and invest somewhere else without rent controls. And so you have these problems. You end up with losses in welfare, right? Consumer producer surplus. You end up with welfare losses. You end up with a social benefit loss from this debt weight loss, right? And you end up with distributional effects. In the end, as I said, you might end up with less apartments to go around, less quality apartments to go around, and that's not good for those individuals that demand apartments, because in fact, you end up with a shortage of high quality apartments. Okay, focus question 7.4. Can we still make improvements that will increase both efficiency and equity? Are there market distortions whose benefits accrue primarily to the rich and whose costs fall predominantly on the poor, whose mitigation will improve both productivity and fairness? Well, can we still make these improvements that will increase efficiency and equity? Well, there are three approaches to doing this, and there are three approaches to social choices. Okay. The first one is compensation principle. All right. Now think for 1 second here. Imagine if you have a roommate who's very loud. Okay. Maybe the roommate likes to play her stereo really loud, or is just loud. Okay. And you say, listen, John or Mary, I really need this place to be peaceful and quiet because I'm studying and I can't have this. And so the roommate will say, listen, well, I pay half of the rent and you pay the other half of the rent, and so I have half as much of a right to be loud as you do half as much of the right to have quiet. So think about that situation. Who gets to decide, right? What's fair and who gets to decide? And how do you, more importantly, how do you mitigate that externality? Well, one way you might mitigate it is to compensate the person that's being affected by the noise by the person that is making the noise. So maybe the noise maker will say, listen, Mary, I'll give you $100 a month so that, because I know I'm noisy and I'm not going to stop being noisy, but if I give you $100 a month, maybe you can use that money and take an Uber to the library, right, and study there. And so maybe if the other roommate might say, okay, that's fine, I'll accept that. And so you compensate, right? And that's one way to internalize the externality. Notice you haven't gotten rid of the noise, but in terms of the welfare, the social welfare, there has been a compensation to that person that is being affected by the harm. All right. If you look at this picture now, you see that not every situation can be remedied like this, and it has to, again, due to the fact that we don't know what every individual wants. We don't know as a society and as a government. We don't know people's preferences. We don't know their utility functions 100%. We can't discriminate perfectly because we just don't know. And so if you see this picture, you see the little boy, he's thinking about this green area as an area that he wishes had a playground. The young lady with the shoes, the red shoes, she's thinking about a shopping center. She's like, you know what? I'd love for this area to have a shopping center so that I could shop and buy clothing, and hang out. And then this other lady, which I'm still not 100% clear on what she's doing, but it seems like she just wants a green pasture where she can walk barefoot and enjoy nature. Every one of these has equal rights to want that. Every person here in this economy would like this area, this common area, to provide what they want. But how does the government and the market determine, first of all, what each of them want, And more importantly, how do they determine, okay, whose desire is more important? Should we value the kid's desire? Should his desire be met? Should his wish be met? Should the lady with the shoes be met and she get a shopping center, right? Or so how do we determine whose indifference curves should be followed and which ones are more important than others, right? If we're talking about happiness, right, utility, right, if we're trying to maximize the utility of this society, of these three individuals, whose utility is more important here, right? And so because we can't arrive at a perfect allocation of that, we have to make trade-offs. We simply have to, the economist and public sector economist and government have to make trade-offs. It's the only way, right? So you might say, okay, well, we're going to have some land, some part of it for green access to land, and maybe a shopping center built. But it won't be as big. It might be smaller. Maybe it might be farther down the street. Maybe we'll have a playground, but it won't be where the child wants it. It might be somewhere else. So trade-offs have to happen, right? Because it's the only way that you're going to be able to provide a situation or an allocation of goods and services that everybody is happy with. Okay. Chapter 8, public production of goods and services. So here we have two big focus questions, okay? Focus question 8.1. What is the role of government in production? What is the rationale behind government production of goods and services, such as electric utilities and water? Why are these called natural monopolies? And what are alternative ways by which abuses of monopoly power might be prevented? Okay. Interesting question. Very, very interesting and difficult question. So here I have, what is the government rationale? Well, remember that the ultimate role, the ultimate rationale for government intervention is to internalize externalities, right? To correct market failures. That's the role of government. That's why government exists in the first place, right? There's obviously other reasons, right? But that's, in terms of the economy, that's the purpose and the justification for the existence of government. So the rationale is to do that. So what does the government do, right, to try and do that? Let's go back to our question here. All right. What is the rationale behind government production of goods and services, such as electric utilities and water? Why are these called natural monopolies? And what are some ways by which these abuses of monopoly might be prevented? So here we have, going back to our picture here, we have these power lines, right? You see these power lines, right? We'll get to them in a minute here. Those are natural monopolies, but we'll get to them in a minute. One way that the government finds or is able to seek efficiency, for example. Remember the trade-off between inequality and efficiency? Well, here's a way where the government can find kind of a medium ground. We want to provide equal access, but we also want to provide it in the most efficient way for society. So one way that the government might seek that is through privatization, right? And this has been a big area of discussion, not only in the U.S., but worldwide. In the International Monetary Fund from the 90s and now, in fact, neoclassical economics and the neoclassical approach has been that, to privatize government utilities and government-run services, because these produce waste and they generate fiscal waste. They are inefficient and they only make the provision of services from government very, very inefficient. And so privatization is one way. Nationalization is another. And now, this may not be so common in the United States, but if you've traveled overseas, especially in places like Latin America, you might have come across some examples of nationalization. One of the examples or cases that came to mind when I was thinking about this topic is the nationalization of PDVSA. It's called PDVSA, PDVSA, which is the Venezuelan national oil company, the Venezuelan oil. Okay, notice in the picture it says socialismo, or it says socialismo o muerte, socialism or death. By the way, okay, this is PDVSA, which was nationalized by then President Hugo Chavez. And what they did was basically say, we are going to expropriate the Venezuelan oil from the private owners, and that oil is no longer theirs. It is now public. It is now belongs to the government. And nationalization can have its justification, can be justified when the private entity is either violating the law or not providing the benefit or the service in a manner that is in the best interest of the people, right? So there are justifications for nationalization, but these justifications are not always followed, right? Or they're not always real, right? There's other justifications. And in the end, unless you are able to run a once privately run entity efficiently, what you're going to end up with is an inefficient provision of that good or service. So coming back, as I said, I'm going to come back to the power lines. Natural monopolies, right? When you have a natural monopoly is something like power lines or the water pipes, right? Or the power lines, not these power lines, but the power lines that we see in neighborhoods. You don't see them as much in the U.S. now. Everything is underground, but in Latin America, you see them all over the place. Imagine, just for a minute, if the market for these gigantic power lines that you see in this picture, imagine if this was private and every single private entity had to build, first of all, buy the land, and then second, build the power lines. We would have the entire United States covered up in power lines, right? And of course, not only would that be horrific in terms of the aesthetic and the misuse of land, but it would also be completely inefficient, right? Because the power can flow from one power line in the same way, right? And so a natural monopoly is that type of monopoly that makes sense where only one entity provided. And so to avoid having the private entity get monopoly power and gain with what we call rents sometime in economics. Rents, not the rent that we pay to the landlord, but rent as in rent-seeking behavior. So to avoid that, government will often provide these goods and services that are natural monopolies, and it makes sense for them to provide them. And they are actually efficient, because it would be inefficient, as I said, to have them be left to the market where you would have competition for these all over the place, and you'd have so many, right? You'd have 3, 4, 5 power line companies competing for the same space. You would have, imagine if you had, and in some places, I know that in some places you have maybe 1 or 2 cable providers, but imagine if you had 50 cable providers. The digging underground for the cable, it would be simply inefficient, right? And so you want to avoid that. So some monopolies, natural monopolies, are best served by government. And then our last question is, what are the causes of government failure? Why is production in the public sector often less efficient than production in the private sector? What are the dangers and limits of privatization? What are the alternatives to conventional public production or purely private production of goods and services? So lots of questions in this one final question. I guess if we can think about this, if we can think about one way to answer all of them, it has to do with organizational differences and individual differences, right? This is the way that we seek to explain the inefficiency in the public sector. First of all, organizational differences. What do we mean? Well, it has a lot to do with, organizational differences has a lot to do with the rules that are in place, and these could be not only rules but laws, legal restrictions, policy restrictions, and state laws, and even constitutional restrictions that make it very difficult for the public sector to be efficient because they have to abide by the law. So aside from the legal policy and constitutional restrictions, you also have to deal with what is politically feasible, right? You see the cartoon here says, why is it that the national debt is not a big deal when a Democrat is in the White House? And then the elephant says, what national debt, right? It's funny, but it's true, right? It has to do with how the politics of the day, how they see and what is feasible politically, right? And so these political battles, if you will, the ebbs and flows of politics often lead to inefficiency in the public sector because you're no longer choosing on what's most efficient, but rather what is politically desirable, right? What is politically feasible. So those are organizational differences. As far as individual differences, here it has many things, right? It has to do with how individuals, whether individuals accept what the government tells them they should do, right? It has to do with how individuals manage risk also, how risk averse or risk loving they are to certain decisions or certain things in the economy, like, for example, the housing market, right? Remember the lending crisis of 2008, the subprime lending crisis? You had the subprime loans, and then you had foreclosures. And who's stuck in the middle? The owner of the house, right? There's no way to escape it. And the problem is that you provide a market where individuals have the incentive to get into these houses, but those individuals will not be able to keep those houses because they were not credit worthy to have them to begin with, right? And so that inefficiency created by the inability to tell people what to do, essentially, right? How do you force somebody not to buy a house because their credit is poor, right? Everybody has that right. And so what ends up happening and what ended up happening was that millions lost their homes. And so millions, not only does it create these horrible distortions in society and negative externalities of all sorts of ways, right? You know, depression and drug and alcohol abuse and all sorts of abuses and you know, horrible things. Right? And so not only has this created all of these negative impacts, but also that you ended up with an inefficient allocation and distribution of goods and services, because you ended up with millions of homes that were foreclosed. And then what did the banks do with these homes? They're not in the market for home selling. The banks are in the market for lending. That's what they know, and that's what they do best. And so when they repossess a house, that's an asset that now becomes a liability to them, and now they have to figure out a way to sell it, and they won't be able to sell it. They'll have to just simply try and realize it in the accounting sense of the word, and so they're going to lose, right? So the banks lose, and if you have a crisis of risk and lending, then how do you then recognize who are those potential borrowers who can actually pay for that house that has been repossessed, right? And so it creates all sorts of distortions. Going back, right, having to do with imperfect information asymmetry, right? All sorts of distortions, but all of these distortions begin with the fact that you have these individual differences, and it's impossible for the government to identify all of them and identify who can and who can't, for example, meet those obligations. The government at times can find ways to get around this, right? There are alternative organizational forms that governments can try and find, I guess, the best of both worlds, or a middle ground, right? A middle ground for reducing some of these inefficiencies, right? And still managing to provide what is politically feasible and what is economically efficient. And that is, for example, we talked about privatization, but in things like private police, right? Privatizing security, right? There are this has been something that has been discussed by economists and by public sector officials and elected officials. Should we go down that path of private security, private police, right? And of course, it's not a costless alternative, because it has all sorts of potential implications, right? In fact, implications that have to do with legal and constitutional rights, right? And if people have their private police, their private security, what does that mean for those that can't afford private police and private security, right? And so it creates all sorts of potential problems. You have things, concepts that have to do with, for instance, public-private partnerships. Okay, a public-private partnership is just what the phrase says. It's a partnership between a private entity and a public entity to provide a good. So we've seen this more and more in the privatization, if you will, or the private management of prisons, right? So prisons are intended to keep people that have been accused of crimes, etc., right, incarcerated, and these are state run, right? And some are federal, but they're government run, or these are things that the public sector should provide. But the public sector is finding that private sector entities are more efficient in providing some of these aspects, not all of the aspects and elements that go into prisons, but some. And so the privatization of some of the elements of prisons is a public-private partnership kind of deal, right? Is that something that we want as a society? Are we okay with that? Okay, so it's not easy to arrive at the best allocation, right? All right. So in summary, I know this has been a long presentation, but just a lot of material. In summary, the role of government exists to correct market failure. Remember that. Okay, that's the original role, right? Natural monopolies are efficient, but not always desirable or attainable. And the reason for that is, yes, we want natural monopolies, like, for example, the power lines and such, or a power company, an electric company, but they're not always desirable because that electric company might be charging us a lot for electricity. If left to competition, we would be paying lower electricity bills, right? And it's not always attainable because it has to do with political issues too, right? Political forces. So it may not. I mean, in other words, you might end up with a provider that is not the most efficient and the cheapest to the consumer, but because you have a political tie, that's the one that you end up with. And then lastly, the trade-off between inequality and efficiency continues to challenge decisions by government and society. Okay? So I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. Again, I thank you very much for taking the time to listen to my lectures. And as always, I wish you well and God bless. Thank you.